Tales from the Crypts of Auld, Reekie. Let me take you on a journey around the cemeteries and burial sites of Edinburgh. Greyfriars Kirkyard stands located at the southern edge of the old town. Burials have been taking place since the late 16th century, and several notable Edinburgh residents buried at Greyfriars. Greyfriars takes its name from the Franciscan friary on the site. The friars wear grey habits, which dissolved in 1560. The churchyard was founded in August 1562 after authorities granted royal sanction to replace the churchyard at St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh. The kirkyard was involved in the history of the Covenanters. The Covenanting movement began with the signing of the National Covenant in Greyfriars Kirk on 28th of February 1638, following the defeat of the militant Covenanters at Bothwell Brig in 1679. Some 1,200 Covenanters remained imprisoned. The accused remained exiled in a field to the south of the churchyard. In the 18th century, part of this field amalgamated into the churchyard as vaulted tombs. The area became known as the Covenanters' Prison. Greyfriars holds the title of Scotland's oldest graveyard. You will hear tales of Greyfriars and many more. Stories of the Edinburgh body snatchers and the devices constructed to prevent their gruesome reign of terror. The relics from this time and the tales of their diabolical nocturnal activities. Tales of the supernatural also present within the grounds of Warriston, situated in the north of the city. Does a ghostly figure continue to walk the cemetery paths today? Sit back and get ready to venture to these locations and more. Prepare for a scare. It is time to come face to face with tales from the crypts of Auld, Reekie. Welcome to Buccleuch Kirkyard, the resting place of William Deacon Brody. Why does his body rest in an unmarked grave? Kerry shall tell you the story.
Deacon William Brody lived from 1741 until the 1st of October 1788. He was a pillar of the Edinburgh Society, a successful cabinet maker, Deacon of the Guild of Wrights and Masons, and an Edinburgh City Councillor. But he was also a man with a severe gambling habit, who needed to maintain the family everyone knew about, as well as 2 mistresses and 5 illegitimate children. William Brody's father had been a cabinet maker before him, and William served an apprenticeship that led to his work, then regarded by some as the best in Edinburgh. He grew to become a supplier of furniture to the rich and famous. Part of the work had to be undertaken in customers' houses and business premises, installing furniture or fitting locks. But Edinburgh had a dark side, an underworld of vice and crime, and Deacon Brody came to know it well. He would frequent drinking and gambling dens, and by 1768 had run up such severe debts to the sort of people you really would not want to owe money to. His lifestyle was becoming increasingly expensive in other ways too. By day he was a respectable family man. By night he maintained 2 mistresses, neither of whom knew of each other's existence, who had borne him 5 illegitimate children between the 2. Deacon Brody first turned to crime to resolve his problems in 1768, when he was able to take impressions of the keys to a bank in the city. His subsequent nighttime robbery of the bank netted him £800, a large amount at the time. To further his criminal activities, Deacon Brody recruited an English locksmith, George Smith. Between them, they launched a highly successful crime wave across the city, even stealing Edinburgh University's silver mace. By 1786, Brody's gang had grown to 4 after recruiting 2 more members, Ainsley and Brown. Brody was becoming more ambitious in his criminal activities, and later in 1786 planned an audacious raid on His Majesty's Excise Office in Chesil's Court, off the Canongate. Brody's role was to act as a lookout, but he fell asleep. As a result, the authorities, alerted to the robbery being in progress, caught the whole gang red-handed. In the event, Brody and 2 others narrowly escaped, but Ainsley was soon caught. Ainsley quickly turned to King's evidence to avoid the gallows, and Smith and Brown were eventually arrested. Deacon Brody fled to Amsterdam, where he lay low for a while, before being detained while boarding a ship bound for North America, and returned to Edinburgh in chains. Brody's trial began on the 27th of August 1788. He appeared convicted based on the words of other gang members and the incriminating items found at his home. This included a stock of duplicate keys, a disguise, and pistols. Brody hanged on the 1st of October 1788 at Edinburgh's toll booth, a grim building that stood in the middle of the high street near St Giles Cathedral. Ironically, the gallows used was one for which Brody, a city councillor, had himself helped authorise the funds. Authorities probably hung him that day. Stories rapidly began to circulate that to cheat the noose, Brody had worn a steel collar to the scaffold, which, with instructions that he should be cut down quickly, had allowed him to survive the experience. Though, in some ways, Deacon Brody's legacy continues. His story is remembered in the Deacon Brody's Tavern on Edinburgh's Royal Mile. Robert Louis Stevenson's fascination with the story of Deacon Brody, who had supplied Stevenson's father with furniture, inspired him to write his classic novel, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The story of Deacon Brody does not end here. On several occasions, a spirit considered to be that of Deacon Brody is sighted leaving the pub of which takes his name. The ghostly figure has been seen walking at speed from the pub entrance, only to disappear along the close, which has also taken his name.
Warriston Cemetery previously has featured in the realms of North Edinburgh nightmares. The impressive burial ground, designed in 1842 by Edinburgh architect David Cousin, the cemetery opened in 1843. Its many sloping paths and great catacombs paint a picture of its once grand past. The first interment was towards the east, Margaret Parker, who was buried on the 3rd of June 1843. Many other notable names would occupy Warriston Cemetery grounds, including artists, politicians and physicians. Soon after instigation in 1845, the cemetery was divided by Edinburgh, Leith and New Haven Railway. Built east to west through its southern half, a tunnel was added with Gothic archways at its mouths. They link the north and south sections, but the smaller south was the inferior area from this date onwards. The railway banks were now partly removed following its closure in the 1950s. The line is now a public walkway. In 1979, BBC Scotland commenced filming a brand new series which would air later that year. The Omega Factor tells the story of the fictional Department 7. The government created a group to investigate paranormal phenomena, extrasensory perception, telekinesis, poltergeist phenomena, out-of-body experiences, and spiritual possession. Whilst filming the 9th episode, titled Double Vision, the cast and crew would embark on Warriston Cemetery. The shoot consisted of day and night filming and would centre upon the grounds close to the catacombs. A dark, hooded figure reported sighted lurking through the camera viewfinder in one late night shoot, even though no one was there. During another recording session, props started moving of their own accord. Other bizarre accidents were logged, including a falling gravestone that hurt one of the crew. Along with the falling gravestone, the cast recalls an incident when a grave collapsed. The ground gave way, resulting in a camera falling in the grave. The camera damage was so severe that the incident lost the camera. Could it be that something was trying to let them know they were not welcome? In the autumn of 2020, I travelled to Warriston once again. This time, my task was to guide a group on a search to attempt to contact a famous Warriston resident, to contact the Red Lady. The Robertson Mortuary Chapel stood erected in 1865 for Mary Ann Robertson, 1826 to 1858, daughter of Brigadier General Manson of the Bombay Artillery. The white marble shrine contained a sculpture of a reclining female figure and was topped by a red glass roof, leading to the local nickname, the Tomb of the Red Lady. The monument was heavily vandalised and later demolished in the late 1980s. Spirit Vision Paranormal Research began in 2019. The group has spent many years previously in the world of paranormal research. The Cheshire-based trio has carried out investigations throughout the British Isles, visiting many of the country's most haunted locations. Sightings of the Red Lady were recorded by various witnesses over the years, although less frequent since the 1980s. The group entered the grounds of Warriston at around 8 p.m. The September weather is pleasant, although now quickly becoming dark. After a tour of the cemetery, the group began to prepare for the evening. They would set up a range of equipment in the vicinity of the Robertson Mortuary, all capable of capturing movement, sound, or a temperature change. As the evening progressed, the group monitored the remains of the tomb. They would ask questions and closely monitor sensory equipment. Nothing occurred for perhaps the first 20 minutes, when suddenly the group were drawn to an illuminated device. The temperature quickly began to drop. The weather was still mild for the time of year, yet readings on the machine sitting upon the tomb continued to fall. As questions continued, other equipment would activate, resulting in movement recorded from the heavy stone base of the tomb. There was nothing at all in the vicinity to cause a tremor of this kind. Spirit Vision Paranormal Research was delighted with the results that night. They have vowed to return and continue research on the Robertson Memorial. Could Mary Ann Robertson, the Red Lady, possibly have reached out that night? One specific question may have been the catalyst to the terrifying results that dark September evening.
Are you annoyed because I took your skull somewhere else, Mary?
He's gone off again.
Oh my God.
The cemeteries of Edinburgh hold many dark tales. the stories echo throughout the gravestones and walls today. Susie Lennox, author of the book Body Snatchers, shall tell you a story.
A wander around Edinburgh's graveyards just wouldn't be complete without a tale or two from their darker, more macabre past. In the years before the Anatomy Act was passed in 1832, right back into the beginning of the 18th century, Edinburgh has always been plagued with people stealing its dead. Medical teaching in Edinburgh at this time was booming, and with the increase in anatomy students studying in the city, also came an increased demand and the number of cadavers that were needed for dissection. With the legal supply being woefully inadequate, there was only really one option available to anatomists and medical students if they wanted to learn the workings of the human body, and that was to get their own supplies. First, it was the students and anatomists themselves, exhuming recently buried corpses under the cover of darkness, scurrying away with them back to the dissecting tables of Edinburgh's anatomy schools. Things got so bad, however, that even as early as 1721, the College of Surgeons were threatening expulsion to any student involved in the art of body snatching. The retrieval of the dead, however, still went on, and as the years ticked by and the thirst for medical knowledge saw no abating, Edinburgh's dead were a regular feature on the dissecting table. As the century wore on, the likelihood of the students and anatomists getting caught body snatching increased, for they were an untidy lot and left evidence of their antics in whichever graveyard they visited. This made way for a professional set of men, and these resurrection men turned body snatching into a very profitable business. Signs of this macabre practice can still be seen throughout the city today, offering a stark reminder of the struggles that Edinburgh's parishioners had against the body snatchers, described by some people as being the lowest dregs of society. In 1738, when St Cuthbert's were being targeted exceptionally hard for their dead, they decided to build an 8-foot wall around its perimeter in an attempt to stop the midnight raids. It is from this graveyard 5 years later that the snatching of Alexander Baxter on the 9th of March would cause a riot in the city, resulting in the destruction of an anatomist's shop and one body snatcher being banished from Scotland a few months later. Despite a regular watch having been set up in the kirkyard in 1803, cadavers were still getting snatched and the city were becoming more and more vigilant as the years went by. No matter what St Cuthbert's tried to do, however, everything seemed fruitless, and by 1827, a little late some may say, they built their famous watchtower, which with its circular design offered a clear view in all directions. By the early 19th century, as professional body snatching became the norm and cadavers were being exhumed at an alarming rate, watchtowers and watchhouses began springing up in other areas of the city. New Carlton Cemetery, Collington and Newington today all boast stone structures that kept a watch party warm and dry during the long winter nights as they kept vigil over the graves. Smaller, simpler structures known as watch houses, found tucked into graveyard corners, meant that many kirkyards had multiple forms of body snatching prevention, although I doubt if any can top the 3 examples I'd found at Greyfriars. The most adopted form of body snatching prevention, however, was the mort safe. Handcrafted by the local blacksmith, these devices came in a manner of different shapes and sizes, from the thick iron overcoffin or iron coffin like those found in Collington and in the National Museum of Scotland, to the more famous, more cage-like design of the double-bedder mort safe, in what is arguably Edinburgh's most famous graveyard, Greyfriars. Parishes would often buy a number of these devices, hiring them out to members of the congregation, as long as they had joined the Mort Safe Society and were up to date with their weekly subs. The mort safes in Edinburgh Greyfriars are unique in their design. They were a private commission, and the first mort safe here would have been accessed via a key. No doubt a few locks and keys were made, and a number of individuals needed to be present in order to open it. The other morte safe, restored in 2010 by Edinburgh World Heritage, was built after the Anatomy Act. The occupiers, the daughters of Major M.E. Lindsay, who died in 1837 and 1838 respectively. Elsewhere in Greyfriars, the fear of resurrection men can be seen on another grave too. Many tourists fail to venture off the main path and so completely miss the caged lair of Surgeon William Ingalls, who died in 1792. The fear of being exhumed and ending up on the dissecting table himself proved too much for this Edinburgh surgeon, forcing him to purchase perhaps the ultimate in body snatching prevention, the caged lair. The lairs in Edinburgh generally follow the same design, stone enclosures with an iron latticed roof to prevent entry. The safety prevention of choice for illustrious members of society, the caged lair represents fear as well as wealth in an age when no corpse was safe. An alternate style of caged lair, similar to an iron fortress, can be found within the city too. Their designs imitating bird cages, holding back the dead like caged animals. One of the finest examples of these can be seen in Old Calton with its thick iron bars, and it would have put any resurrection man off. The dead were easy pickings, and there were many more unguarded graves where cadavers could be snatched with much less effort. But no amount of body snatching prevention could stop the antics of Edinburgh's most famous murderers, Burke and Hare. Linked to body snatching purely because they sold their victims to the notorious Dr. Robert Knox for use in his dissecting rooms, Burke and Hare, despite what many people say, hadn't lifted a spade in their life. Well, not for body snatching anyway. Their method of murder was suffocation, with the press dubbing it Burking after one of the murderers himself, Mr. William Burke. A word still listed in dictionaries today to describe someone who is suffocated or smothered. Their killing spree came to an end on the night of All Hallows Eve 1828, after their final victim, Mary Docherty, was discovered hidden under a pile of straw in the corner of the room in Hare's squalid doss house in Tanner's Close. For the 10 months previous, this murdering duo had trundled their victims in tea chests through Edinburgh's streets, right up to the doors of Dr. Knox's anatomy schools, which stood next door to the old Surgeons' Hall in Surgeons' Square. Here, the bartering would be done. An average price of £10 per corpse was paid, the current going rate for a cadaver, and a fresh one at that, during the dissecting period. By the time Burke was hanging from the scaffold in Edinburgh's Lawn Market, and Hare was making his way south on a coach to Dumfries, the pair had spent every last bit of their profit, a whopping £102 10 shillings. Reminders of this dark period in Edinburgh's history haven't disappeared completely, for the infamous William Burke can still be found throughout the city. Following his hanging on the 28th of January 1829, his body was cut down and taken to the medical rooms at the University of Edinburgh. Like all murderers of this period, he was dissected in accordance to the 1752 Murder Act. His skeleton was then boiled and cleaned of its flesh before being articulated. Today, his skeleton hangs in accordance to his sentence. That if ever it was customary to preserve skeletons, yours will be preserved, in order that prosperity may keep in remembrance your atrocious crimes. And so it is that Burke now hangs in a display case in the Anatomy Museum in Teviot Place. Burke's skin didn't go to waste either, for a section of it was saved and tanned and made into a pocketbook cover, proudly displayed in an exhibition case alongside his death mask in Surgeons' Hall. The etching on the front reading, "Executed, 28th of January, 1829.
Edinburgh's grandest grave is in the least likely place among bungalows beside Bowling Green, known as the Craig and Tinney Marbles. William Henry Miller 1789-1848, was MP for Newcastle under Lyme in the 1830s. In life, he collected books, nicknamed Measure Miller. He'd carry a ruler, pedantically checking the width of all the books before buying. In death, a bachelor, Miller put careful measures in place to be buried 40 feet face down in a lead-lined coffin. His memorial should have resembled Temple of Vesta. However, project was troubled and architect David Rhine's work is inspired by Rome's Appian Way. Panels by Alfred Gatley depict Bible scenes, overthrow of Pharaoh and song of Moses and Miriam, violent and euphoric chaos. Labourers dug the stone-lined shaft beneath. Miller wanted buried on his own estate, Craigentinny Fields, far away from church or congregation. Only when Leith merged with Edinburgh in 1920 was the land earmarked for residential use. Thus nowadays the absurd suburban juxtaposition. So why 40 feet deep? There are stories about occultism and vampirism, Miller's being claimed to be a werewolf, buried face down with his back to the moon. Most common explanation is fear of grave robbers. That died out by 1848, though it wasn't a concern after 1832's Anatomy Act. Had youthful fears of resurrection men seeped too deeply? In this instance, we favour the most oft-refuted explanation. In 1890, the book Old and New Edinburgh claimed that Miller was averred to be a changeling, even a woman, a suggestion which his thin figure, weak voice, absence of all beard and some peculiarity of habit seemed to corroborate. The notion that Miller wasn't male seems to get dismissed on grounds of implausibility. However, it's not there are many precedents of women masquerading as men in a high society adept at turning a blind eye. Famously, in Miller's own lifetime, lived the surgeon James Miranda Barry, born a woman. By the time she studied at Edinburgh University in 1809, she was living as a man. So, was Mr. Miller perhaps the first female MP? Afraid his secret would be exposed in death. City of the Dead tours have operated within the dark cobbled streets of Edinburgh for many years, providing tours and events the likes of which shall chill you to the bone. Today, Grant shall relay terrifying tales of the infamous Covenanters' prison.
Classically, in Scotland, we were very zealously religious. We were fairly worried in the 1600s that the English were going to impose their religion upon us, Anglicanism, with its bishops and cathedrals and stained glass windows. So in 1638 in Greyfriars, we decided to draw up a contract between ourselves and God called the National Covenant. It's literally a piece of parchment, and people queued up in Greyfriars to sign it. The more zealous of them, they signed it in their own blood. The Covenanters, they took their contract north, south, east and west. They became the greatest mass movement in Scottish history. 60% of the adult population were Covenanters. And they were a mighty movement. They were a powerful one. In the 1650s, when Oliver Cromwell ruled for a decade in England, the only way he could keep Scotland under control was by giving it to the Covenanters. It became the rule of the saints. It was a brutal time to be alive because it was a religious orthodoxy. And religious orthodoxies can be very, very difficult times if you're not on the same wavelength and you don't preach from the same hymn sheet as the people in power. When England went back to the monarchy, when they decided Oliver Cromwell was a bit of a bam, wasn't he? They went back, Charles II became the king, they pretended republicanism had never happened, and when the monarchs came back into power they looked up to Scotland and they said, no, I'm not dealing with the rule of the saints. So they set about removing them from power, and from a position of having governed for an entire decade, unchallenged, they became terrorists. They weren't allowed to talk about covenanting things, they weren't allowed to preach in public. The ministers of the movement, they became guerrilla rebels. They carried guns in their coat pockets. They wandered the hillsides preaching these very fiery sermons that would attract thousands of people. Ultimately, to snuff out the movement, it became the killing times. The killing times was literally a period in Scottish history when you could ask someone, are you a Covenanter? If they said yes, you could shoot them dead on the spot. After decades of guerrilla warfare, the Covenanters, they fought their final battle. It's called the Battle of Bothwell Brig. It was in Lanarkshire. After Bothwell Brig, 1,200 of them were all that was left alive after they were decimated by government forces. They marched them barefoot back to Edinburgh, the capital. There was no room for them. There wasn't any room in the jails. There was no room in the castle dungeons. So what do you do? What do you do with traitors? What do you do with terrorists? The Lord Advocate at the time was a man called George Mackenzie of Rose Hall. He decided Greyfriars is where they first signed their little contract, their little covenant. It's poetic justice that that's where they meet their maker. There's a space, there's a plot of land to the south of the Flawn Wall in Greyfriars. We'll put them there in linen tents. We'll see how a winter in Edinburgh suits them. 1,200 men, they come into what's now known as the Covenanters' prison. They're put there over the winter months of 1678. They're tortured, they're given thumbscrews and Spanish boots. Their joints are pulverised, the marrow spills out their legs, they die of infection. Many are hanged down on the grass market. The ones that try to flee are shot against the Flawn Wall. Hunger kills most, I suppose. 4 ounces of bread a day in rations, that's Auschwitz rations. The cold. As cold as it is right now in Scotland, in the winter months of the 1600s, the Clyde River would be frozen over for 4 months of the year. They die of exposure. After the winter, there's only 400 of them left in here, skeletal, emaciated figures. They become an embarrassment to the city. And what do you do with an embarrassment? Something you want rid of. Send it to America. They load them into a slave ship down in Leith and off it sails to the plantations. The ship carrying them, it sank off the Orkney Islands in the Pentland Firth. The last of the Covenanters, the greatest mass movement in Scottish history, they ended up drowning in the sea. Their stories, refuted to this day admittedly on Orkney, that the islanders refused to help them out of the water. So where does the ghost come in? Well, the thing is about the Covenanters' prison, the man that made it, George Mackenzie, about 15 years later when he died, a celebrated man down in Westminster, he decided to have himself buried inevitably, right next to the prison he created. The most opulent tomb, in this entire graveyard. A thing that would cost you £2 million in today's money. From the early 1700s, we boys from the school over the wall there, George Heriot's, they'd climb over the wall in the night from their dorm rooms. They said that George Mackenzie's soul was so restless, if you knocked on his door in the night time, he'd come and visit you. The soul was so restless, it was trapped in the prison it had created. There was an upsurge of interest in the Covenanters prison in the late 1990s. Ultimately, the newspapers, they sensed good copy, so they decided to enlist an exorcist, I suppose you would call him, the Reverend Colin Grant. In February of 2000, he came to Greyfriars with his Bible and his holy water and his crucifix. He came with the Edinburgh Evening News. They walked him through the graveyard. They photographed it. You can see, some people say, what's following him, reflected in the windows of the church. Eventually he came to the gates of the Covenanters prison. He says this is where it's strongest. He came in here on his own. He's a 60-year-old man, he came in here on his own. He was pacing about, chanting, for half an hour. He stumbles out the gates, pale, shaking, sweating. When he stumbles out the gates, he says to the journalists, "It's not a poltergeist. It's no one thing." He called the Covenanters prison a drowning sea of souls. He said they were trapped here. They were writhing. They were in agony. He tried as best as he could to free as many as he could. He's an old man. He wanted to go home. They carry him out the gates. He went home. He never came back to finish the job. He was doing a tarot card reading in his shop on St Mary's Street in the week that followed. He was drawing the cards for this wee lassie in the shop. He suddenly stopped. He looked over at her. He says, "I've no more good news to give you, madam. I've only bad news." Had a heart attack. Died in his shop less than a week after his exorcism.
The Red Lady calls upon you, her tomb now long since gone. The gates of Covenanters prison, the ravens sing their song. St Cuthbert's and its watchtower, the legacy remain. The dark crypts of Auld Reekie, please be sure to call again.